Sarah Martinez never imagined that a simple visit to see her husband would transform her from a military spouse into a battlefield legend. What started as a surprise reunion at Forward Operating Base Phoenix became one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in modern warfare. This is the true story of how love, determination, and deadly precision turned an ordinary woman into an unlikely hero when her world exploded into chaos. Sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't the ones soldiers carry in a battle. They're the ones carried in the heart. The dust clouds swirled around the military transport vehicle as it approached Forward Operating Base Phoenix in the harsh landscape of Afghanistan. Sarah Martinez pressed her face against the small window, her heart racing with excitement and nervousness. After 8 months of separation, she was finally going to surprise her husband, Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez, who had no idea she was coming. The journey to reach this remote outpost had been anything but simple. Sarah had spent weeks coordinating with military officials, filling out endless paperwork, and jumping through bureaucratic hoops just to get permission for this visit. As a registered nurse back in Texas, she had used her medical credentials to volunteer for a short-term humanitarian mission that would bring her to the region. It was the perfect cover for her real mission, seeing Miguel again. The base appeared ahead like a fortress carved from the desert itself. Concrete barriers, watchtowers, and razor wire created an imposing perimeter around what had become home to over 300 American and coalition forces. Sarah clutched her medical bag tighter, feeling the weight of the moment. She had practiced this reunion in her mind countless times during sleepless nights back home. As their convoy passed through the main gate, Sarah noticed the tension in the faces of the soldiers around her. This wasn't just any military base. This was a frontline position in one of the most dangerous regions of the country. Recent intelligence reports had indicated increased enemy activity in the surrounding areas, but Sarah had pushed those concerns aside. Nothing was going to stop her from seeing her husband. The vehicle came to a stop near the medical facility where Sarah would be working during her stay. The compound was bustling with activity as soldiers went about their daily routines. Some were returning from patrol, their faces covered in dust and exhaustion. Others were preparing for their next mission, checking equipment and studying maps. The air was thick with the constant hum of generators, helicopter rotors in the distance, and the occasional crackling of radio communications. Sarah stepped out onto the gravel, immediately feeling the intense heat despite it being late afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the base. She had been warned about the extreme conditions, but experiencing them firsthand was different. The air was dry and carried the scent of diesel fuel, concrete dust, and something else she couldn't quite identify, the smell of a place where danger lurked just beyond the horizon. A young lieutenant approached her with a clipboard and a professional smile. "Ms. Martinez, welcome to FOB Phoenix. I'm Lieutenant Johnson, and I'll be showing you to your quarters and briefing you on base procedures." Sarah nodded, trying to contain her excitement about the surprise she had planned. As they walked through the base, Lieutenant Johnson explained the layout and pointed out important locations: the mess hall, the communications center, the armory, and the various barracks. Sarah listened politely, but her eyes were constantly scanning for any sign of Miguel. She knew he was somewhere in this maze of concrete and steel, probably unaware that his world was about to change. The medical facility was larger than Sarah had expected, with several treatment rooms, a small surgical suite, and a pharmacy stocked with supplies for treating everything from minor injuries to combat wounds. Dr. Patricia Chun, the base's chief medical officer, greeted Sarah warmly and showed her around the facility. The two women hit it off immediately, bonding over their shared experiences in medicine and the unique challenges of working in a combat zone. "We're grateful to have you here," Dr. Chun said as they finished the tour. "Your trauma experience will be invaluable. We've been dealing with an increase in casualties lately, and every skilled pair of hands makes a difference." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was here for Miguel, but she was also here to serve others who desperately needed medical care. As evening approached, Sarah finally worked up the courage to ask about her husband. She had been careful not to mention their relationship during the official briefings, wanting to keep the surprise intact. "Dr. Chun," she said casually, "I'm curious about the base's defensive positions. I noticed there are sniper teams stationed around the perimeter. How does that work?" Dr. Chin's expression grew more serious. Yes, our sniper teams are crucial for base security. We have several excellent marksmen who keep watch day and night. Staff Sergeant Martinez leads one of our best teams. He's got an incredible record for accuracy and has saved countless lives with his vigilance. Sarah's heart swelled with pride hearing about her husband's reputation, but she kept her expression neutral. That's impressive, Sarah replied, hoping her voice didn't betray her emotions. I'd be interested in learning more about how the medical team coordinates with the snipers during emergencies. It was a legitimate professional question, but it also gave her a reason to seek out Miguel's position. Dr. Chin nodded approvingly. Smart thinking. Tomorrow morning, I'll introduce you to the sniper teams during their briefing. Understanding our tactical medical protocols is essential for your work here. Sarah felt a thrill of anticipation. Tomorrow morning, she would finally see Miguel again. That night, Sarah lay on her narrow bunk in the temporary quarters, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the base settling into its night routine. Guard towers remained active, their searchlights occasionally sweeping across the compound. The distant sound of radio chatter mixed with the hum of equipment and the occasional call of night birds from beyond the perimeter. She thought about Miguel and wondered what he was doing at that moment. Was he on watch duty, peering through his scope at the darkness beyond the base? Was he sleeping fitfully as she was, plagued by dreams of home and family? Or was he writing one of his letters, the ones that took weeks to reach her and always smelled faintly of gun oil and desert dust? Their marriage had been tested by multiple deployments, but their love had only grown stronger. Miguel's letters were filled with descriptions of the harsh beauty of Afghanistan, the brotherhood he shared with his fellow soldiers, and his dreams for their future together. He wrote about wanting to start a family when he returned home, about the house they would buy with the money he was saving from his deployment pay, and about growing old together in the peaceful hills of Texas. Sarah had brought one of his letters with her, the most recent one she had received before leaving for Afghanistan. In it, Miguel had written about a particularly difficult mission where his sniper skills had prevented an ambush that could have killed dozens of soldiers. He described the weight of responsibility he felt every time he looked through his scope, knowing that lives depended on his decisions and his aim. Sometimes I feel like I'm holding the world steady in my crosshairs, he had written. Every shot has to count, because there are no second chances out here. But I think about you and home, and my hands stay steady. You're my anchor, Sarah. You keep me grounded even when everything else is chaos. Reading those words again in the darkness of her temporary quarters, Sarah felt a deep appreciation for the burden her husband carried. Tomorrow, she would surprise him, but she would also gain a first-hand understanding of the dangerous world he navigated every day. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah had no idea that her surprise visit would become something much more significant. She couldn't have imagined that within days, she would be tested in ways she never thought possible. The woman who had come to surprise her husband with love would soon surprise everyone with her courage. The base grew quiet around midnight, settling into the routine of night watch. Sentries took their positions, and the sniper teams, including Miguel's, maintained their vigilant watch over the perimeter. In the distance, the mountains loomed like sleeping giants, hiding secrets and dangers that would soon test everyone at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. Sarah's dreams that night were filled with images of reunion, of Miguel's surprised face, of holding him close after months of separation. But somewhere in the depths of her subconscious, there was also an awareness of the tension that permeated this place, a feeling that something important was building, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Tomorrow would bring the reunion she had traveled so far to achieve, but it would also set in motion a series of events that would change both their lives forever. The surprise visit that Sarah had planned so carefully was about to become the beginning of a much larger story, one that would test not just their love for each other, but their courage, their skills, and their determination to protect the lives of others. Forward Operating Base Phoenix slept fitfully that night, unaware that it stood on the brink of a battle that would become legendary, and that a nurse from Texas would soon become an unlikely hero in the harsh landscape of Afghanistan. The morning sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink as Sarah made her way to the tactical briefing room. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she followed Dr. Chun through the maze of concrete corridors. After months of planning and weeks of travel, the moment she had dreamed about was finally at hand. The briefing room was filled with the quiet intensity that marked every military operation. Maps covered the walls, marked with colored pins indicating friendly positions, known threats, and patrol routes. A dozen soldiers sat around a large table, their faces serious as they discussed the day's security protocols. Sarah's eyes swept the room, searching for the familiar face she had missed so desperately. Then she saw him. Miguel was seated near the back of the room, his attention focused on a detailed terrain map spread out before him. He looked different, leaner, more weathered by months in the desert sun, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of constant vigilance. His dark hair was shorter than she remembered, and his hands, which she had kissed goodbye so many months ago, now showed the calluses and scars of a soldier who had seen combat. Dr. Chen cleared her throat and addressed the room. "Gentlemen, I'd like to introduce our new medical volunteer, Nurse Martinez. She'll be working with our medical team and learning about our tactical medical protocols." Sarah stepped forward, her professional training helping her maintain composure even as her personal world threatened to explode with emotion. Miguel's head snapped up at the mention of the name Martinez. His eyes met Sarah's across the room, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. The color drained from his face before rushing back in a wave of disbelief, joy, and concern. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Around them, the other soldiers began to notice the electric tension that had suddenly filled the room. "Sarah." Miguel's voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking her name too loudly might make the vision disappear. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. "What are you doing here?" The other soldiers looked back and forth between them, beginning to understand that this was no ordinary introduction. Sergeant First Class David Thompson, Miguel's spotter and closest friend at the base, grinned widely as he put the pieces together. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered under his breath. Sarah took a step forward, her professional facade cracking as emotions threatened to overwhelm her. "I came to surprise you," she said, her voice trembling with barely controlled excitement. "I volunteered for medical mission. I couldn't stay away any longer." The briefing room erupted in a mixture of cheers, whistles, and good-natured ribbing from Miguel's fellow soldiers. These men had heard countless stories about Sarah over the months, had seen Miguel's face light up whenever he received one of her letters, and had watched him carry her photograph on every mission. To them, she wasn't just a surprise visitor. She was a legend brought to life. Miguel moved around the table like a man in a dream, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. When they were finally close enough to touch, they both hesitated for a moment, overwhelmed by the reality of being together again. Then, Miguel reached out and gently touched her face, as if confirming she was real. "I can't believe you're here," he whispered. "I can't believe you actually came all this way." His voice broke slightly on the last words, and Sarah saw tears gathering in his eyes, tears that he quickly blinked away, mindful of his audience. "I had to see you," Sarah replied, reaching up to cover his hand with hers. "I couldn't wait anymore. I needed to know you were okay, to see for myself that you were safe." The room had grown quiet as the soldiers witnessed this intimate reunion. These were hard men who had seen terrible things, but they understood the power of love and the strength it took for a woman to travel halfway around the world to surprise her husband in a combat zone. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, the base commander, entered the room just as Miguel and Sarah embraced. He took in the scene immediately, recognizing both the breach of protocol and the extraordinary circumstances. A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he cleared his throat. "I take it this is a personal acquaintance, Staff Sergeant Martinez?" he asked with mock formality. Miguel snapped to attention while still keeping one arm around Sarah. "Sir, this is my wife, Sarah Martinez." "I had no idea she was coming, sir." Patterson nodded approvingly. "Well, it seems we have an even more qualified medical volunteer than we realized. Mrs. Martinez, your husband has mentioned you frequently in his letters home. It's good to finally meet the woman who keeps our best sniper motivated." Sarah felt a warm glow at the praise from Miguel, but she also noticed the underlying tension in the room. Despite the joy of the reunion, these men were still focused on their mission, still aware of the dangers that surrounded them every day. "Sir," Miguel said, "I want to request that my wife be assigned to the safest possible duties while she's here. She shouldn't be anywhere near the action." Sarah started to protest, but Patterson raised his hand. "Staff Sergeant, I understand your concern, but Mrs. Martinez volunteered for this assignment knowing the risks. She's a trained trauma nurse with valuable skills we need. We'll take appropriate precautions, but we won't waste her talents keeping her locked in a bunker. The rest of the briefing continued with Sarah learning about the base's defensive positions, medical protocols, and the current threat assessment. She was impressed by the professionalism and expertise of Miguel's unit, but she was also sobered by the reality of their situation. This wasn't a training exercise or a peacekeeping mission. This was an active combat zone where lives hung in the balance every day. After the briefing, Miguel was given permission to show Sarah around his section of the base. They walked hand in hand through the compound, talking quietly and trying to fill in the gaps created by months of separation. Miguel pointed out his sniper position, a reinforced tower that offered commanding views of the surrounding terrain. "This is where I spend most of my time," he explained, leading her up the stairs to the observation deck. "From here, I can cover the main approaches to the base. It's not glamorous work, but it's important." Sarah looked out through the reinforced windows at the stark landscape beyond the base perimeter. Rolling hills stretched to distant mountains, their surfaces broken by rocky outcroppings and sparse vegetation. It was beautiful in its own harsh way, but she could also see why it was so dangerous. There were countless places for enemies to hide, numerous approaches they could use to threaten the base. "How do you stand the constant tension?" she asked, genuinely curious about how her husband had adapted to this environment. Miguel was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "You learn to live with it," he said finally. "The uncertainty becomes normal after a while. But having you here now," he paused, shaking his head. "I'm not sure if it makes me feel better or more worried. I'm happier than I've been in months, but I'm also terrified something might happen to you." Sarah took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses and strength that came from months of handling weapons and equipment. "I'm trained for this kind of environment," she reminded him. "I've worked trauma in emergency rooms, dealt with gunshot wounds, and critical injuries. I can handle whatever comes." "This is different," Miguel insisted. "In a hospital, you're not the target. Out here, everyone is a potential target. The enemy doesn't distinguish between combatants and medical personnel." Before Sarah could respond, the sharp crack of rifle fire echoed across the base. Both of them instinctively ducked, and Miguel's hand moved automatically toward his weapon. The shots came again, followed by the sound of voices shouting commands. "Training exercise," Miguel explained, seeing Sarah's alarmed expression. "We run live-fire drills regularly to keep everyone sharp." But his eyes continued to scan the horizon, and Sarah could see that even during routine exercises, he never completely relaxed his vigilance. They spent the rest of the morning together, sharing stories, catching up on news from home, and simply enjoying being in each other's presence. Miguel told her about his fellow soldiers, describing their personalities and quirks with obvious affection. He spoke about Sergeant Thompson, his spotter, who had become like a brother to him. He mentioned Private Rodriguez, barely 19 years old, who reminded Miguel of his younger brother back home. He described Lieutenant Harris, a dedicated officer who looked after his men like a protective father. Sarah, in turn, told Miguel about her work at the hospital, about their families back home, and about the small details of daily life that seemed both precious and trivial in this harsh environment. She described the new restaurant that had opened near their home, the way their neighbor's garden had bloomed that spring, and the letters his mother had sent asking when they planned to give her grandchildren. As the day progressed, Sarah began her medical duties, working alongside Dr. Chun to treat routine injuries and illnesses. The medical facility was well-equipped and efficiently run, but she could see the strain that constant readiness placed on the staff. They had to be prepared for anything from minor cuts to mass casualty events, often with limited resources and no possibility of evacuating critical patients to better-equipped hospitals. Her first patient was a young soldier who had twisted his ankle during a training exercise. As she examined his injury and applied a compression bandage, she found herself impressed by his stoicism and good humor despite the pain. These soldiers had learned to endure discomfort as a matter of course, treating injuries that would send civilians to the emergency room as minor inconveniences. Throughout the day, Miguel stopped by the medical facility whenever his duties allowed, checking on Sarah and introducing her to other members of his unit. She could see how much his fellow soldiers respected him, how they looked to him for guidance and expertise. Several of them mentioned specific instances where Miguel's shooting had saved their lives or prevented disasters. "Your husband is the best shot I've ever seen," Sergeant Thompson told her during one visit. "He can put a bullet exactly where it needs to go under any conditions. We sleep better at night, knowing he's watching over us." As evening approached, Sarah and Miguel found a few quiet moments together on a small balcony outside the medical facility. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold. Despite the beauty of the moment, Sarah could feel the weight of the place settling around them. The constant awareness of danger, the knowledge that this peaceful interlude could be shattered at any moment. "I'm so glad you came," Miguel said softly, putting his arm around her. "I know it's dangerous, and I know I should probably be angry that you put yourself at risk, but I can't bring myself to care about anything except having you here." Sarah leaned against him, feeling the solid strength of his presence. "I needed to see this place," she said. "I needed to understand what your life is like out here. Reading your letters wasn't enough anymore." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell over the base and the night shift took over security duties. Floodlights illuminated key areas of the compound, and Sarah could see the silhouettes of soldiers at their posts, maintaining the vigilant watch that never ended in places like this. Neither of them could have imagined that this peaceful moment was the calm before a storm that would test everything they had learned about courage, skill, and sacrifice. The reunion that had brought them together was about to become the foundation for a test neither of them could have prepared for, but which would ultimately prove the strength of their bond and the depths of their individual capabilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patients for Sarah to treat, and new threats for Miguel to watch for through his scope. But tonight, they were together again, and for this moment, that was enough. 3 days had passed since Sarah's arrival at Forward Operating Base Phoenix, and she had settled into a routine that felt both familiar and surreal. Her medical training served her well as she worked alongside Dr. Chun and the base medical team, treating everything from heat exhaustion to minor combat injuries. Yet every moment was colored by the knowledge that her husband was somewhere on the base, vigilantly watching for threats that could materialize at any time. The morning of the 4th day began like any other. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of reveille echoing across the compound. Through her small window, she could see the first hints of sunrise painting the eastern mountains in shades of purple and gold. The base was already coming alive with the sounds of soldiers preparing for another day of operations. After a quick breakfast in the mess hall, Sarah made her way to the medical facility where Dr. Chun was reviewing the night's incident reports. "Quiet night," Dr. Chun observed, looking up from her paperwork. "No casualties, no emergencies. Sometimes I almost forget we're in a combat zone during stretches like this." Sarah nodded, understanding what she meant. There was a strange normalcy to life on the base that made it easy to forget the constant danger lurking beyond the perimeter. Soldiers went about their daily routines, mail arrived from home, and the mess hall served decent food. It was only when you looked closely that you noticed the weapons everyone carried, the tension in people's faces, and the way conversations often stopped mid-sentence when radio chatter crackled over the speakers. "Dr. Chun," Sarah said as they prepared for morning rounds, "I've been wondering about something." Miguel mentioned that there's been increased enemy activity in the region lately. "Are we expecting any specific threats?" Dr. Chin's expression grew more serious. "Intelligence reports suggest that hostile forces have been moving equipment and personnel into positions around several bases in this sector. Nothing concrete enough to act on, but enough to keep everyone on high alert. That's part of why we're so grateful to have your expertise here. If something does happen, we'll need every qualified medical professional we can get." As if summoned by their conversation, Lieutenant Colonel Patterson appeared in the doorway of the medical facility. His usually calm demeanor showed signs of strain, and Sarah noticed that he was wearing full combat gear despite being inside the secure perimeter of the base. "Dr. Chun, Mrs. Martinez," he greeted them formally. "I need to brief you on some developments. We've received credible intelligence indicating a possible coordinated attack on this base within the next 24 to 48 hours. All non-essential personnel are being evacuated, which means Mrs. Martinez should prepare to leave on the next transport helicopter." Sarah felt her heart sink. She had only just arrived, had only begun to understand Miguel's world, and now she was being told to leave just when he might need her most. "Sir," she said carefully, "if an attack is expected, Won't you need every available medical professional? My trauma experience could be valuable. Patterson studied her for a long moment. Mrs. Martinez, I appreciate your dedication, but you're a civilian volunteer. My responsibility is to protect you, not put you in harm's way. Your husband would never forgive me if something happened to you under my command. With respect, sir, Sarah replied, drawing on the strength that had carried her through years of emergency medicine. I came here knowing the risks. I'm not just Miguel's wife. I'm a trained trauma nurse with experience in critical care. If soldiers are going to be wounded, I can help save their lives. Dr. Chin stepped forward to support Sarah's argument. Colonel, she's right. Her skills could make the difference between life and death for our wounded. We've been operating with a skeleton medical staff, and if we're facing a major engagement, we'll need everyone we can get. Patterson was clearly torn between his protective instincts and his practical understanding of the situation. After a long moment, he made his decision. Mrs. Martinez, if you choose to stay, you'll be doing so against my strong recommendation and despite the obvious risks. You'll need to sign additional waivers absolving the military of responsibility for your safety. Are you absolutely certain about this? Sarah thought about Miguel, somewhere in the base preparing his rifle and checking his equipment. She thought about the young soldiers she had met over the past few days, barely older than teenagers, who faced mortal danger with courage and determination. Yes, sir. I am staying. Patterson nodded grimly. Very well. Dr. Chun, please brief Mrs. Martinez on our emergency medical protocols. All medical personnel need to be prepared for mass casualty procedures. He paused at the doorway. And Mrs. Martinez? Your husband doesn't know about this intelligence yet. I prefer you let me tell him. After Patterson left, Dr. Chun wasted no time in bringing Sarah up to speed on the base's emergency medical procedures. They reviewed triage protocols, discussed the locations of emergency medical supplies, and practiced procedures for treating multiple trauma patients simultaneously. Sarah's training in civilian emergency medicine translated well to military medicine, but there were important differences in equipment, protocols, and the types of injuries they might encounter. In civilian trauma, we usually have time to stabilize patients and get them to surgery, Dr. Chin explained as they checked their supplies. Here, we might have to perform life-saving procedures under fire with limited equipment, while the battle is still going on around us. The key is to focus on what you can control and not let the chaos overwhelm your clinical judgment. Meanwhile, across the base, Miguel was receiving his own briefing from his unit commander. The sniper teams have been placed on highest alert, with orders to maintain constant observation of all approaches to the base. Miguel's position in the northeast tower gave him excellent fields of fire across the most likely attack routes, and his reputation for accuracy had earned him the responsibility of covering the main gate area. Sergeant Thompson, his spotter, was already in position when Miguel climbed the stairs to their observation post. Martinez, Thompson greeted him, not looking away from his binoculars. Heard your wife's staying for the party. You okay with that? Miguel felt a knot of fear and pride tightened in his chest. She's tougher than I am in some ways, he said, settling in behind his rifle and adjusting the scope. But that doesn't mean I'm not scared for her. If something happens to her because I brought her into this world. Thompson interrupted, finally lowering his binoculars. She didn't come here because you brought her. She came because she loves you enough to risk everything. That's not on you. That's on her, and it makes her pretty damn brave in my book. Miguel nodded, checking his rifle, zeroing, and ensuring all his equipment was ready. He had learned to compartmentalize his emotions during combat operations, but having Sarah on the base added a new dimension of complexity. He would have to trust that she could take care of herself while he focused on protecting everyone else. As the day progressed, the tension on the base became palpable. Soldiers moved with more urgency, weapons were cleaned and checked repeatedly, and radio chatter increased as units coordinated their defensive preparations. Sarah continued her medical duties, treating a soldier who had cut his hand on a piece of equipment and helping Dr. Chun organize their supplies for maximum efficiency. During a brief break, Sarah managed to visit Miguel at his position. She found him and Thompson maintaining their vigilant watch, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Miguel looked up as she approached, his face showing both joy at seeing her and concern for her safety. You should be on a helicopter heading home, he said, though his tone suggested he was proud of her decision to stay. "Someone needs to look after you troublemakers when you get yourselves shot," Sarah replied with a smile that didn't quite hide her own nervousness. "Besides, I didn't come all this way just to leave when things get interesting." Thompson chuckled from his position at the spotting scope. "She's definitely your wife, Martinez. Got the same stubborn streak you do." They talked quietly for a few minutes, both of them aware that this might be one of their last peaceful moments together for a while. Sarah learned more about Miguel's responsibilities as a sniper, how he had to calculate wind speed and direction, account for the ballistic characteristics of his ammunition, and make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for his fellow soldiers. "The hardest part isn't the shooting," Miguel explained. "It's the waiting. Hours of watching, staying alert, knowing that the moment you relax or lose focus could be the moment something terrible happens." As evening approached, the base's defensive preparations intensified. Additional ammunition was distributed to key positions, communication systems were tested and retested, and soldiers took their positions for what everyone hoped would be another quiet night, but feared might be something much more dangerous. Sarah worked late into the evening, helping Dr. Chun prepare the medical facility for potential casualties. They set up additional treatment areas, checked and double-checked their equipment, and reviewed their procedures one final time. Despite her years of experience in emergency medicine, Sarah felt a nervous energy she had never experienced before. This wasn't just about treating patients, it was about preparing for war. Around midnight, as Sarah was finally preparing to get some rest, she heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching the base. She looked out the window to see a Black Hawk helicopter landing at the base's helipad, its rotors kicking up clouds of dust in the darkness. Several figures disembarked quickly and disappeared into the command center. Dr. Chun appeared beside her at the window. "That's not a scheduled arrival," she observed quietly. "Looks like our intelligence was right. Something big is about to happen." Neither of them slept well that night. The base maintained its heightened state of alert, with double the normal number of sentries on duty and all defensive positions fully manned. Sarah lay on her narrow bunk, listening to the sounds of a military installation preparing for battle, thinking about Miguel and his tower, and wondering what tomorrow would bring. In his sniper position, Miguel maintained his watch throughout the night, his eyes adjusted to the darkness as he scanned the terrain beyond the base perimeter. Thompson dozed fitfully beside him, ready to spring into action at the first sign of trouble. Both men had been through combat before, but the knowledge that Miguel's wife was somewhere below them in the medical facility added a personal dimension to their professional duties. As dawn approached on what would become the most significant day of Sarah's life, the base held its collective breath. Intelligence suggested an attack was imminent, but no one could predict exactly when, where, or how it would come. All they could do was maintain their vigilance, trust in their training, and hope that when the moment came, they would be ready for whatever challenges awaited them. The sun rose slowly over forward operating base Phoenix, painting the surrounding mountains in brilliant shades of orange and red. It was going to be a beautiful day, but everyone on the base knew that beauty could quickly turn to terror in a place where enemies watch from the shadows and death could arrive without warning. Sarah stood at the window of the medical facility, watching Miguel's tower in the distance, and sending up a silent prayer for his safety and the safety of all the brave men and women who had become her temporary family. She had no way of knowing that within hours she would be tested in ways she never could have imagined, and that her presence at Forward Operating Base Phoenix would prove to be far more significant than anyone could have predicted. The attack came with the brutal suddenness of a lightning strike, transforming the peaceful morning routine of Forward Operating Base Phoenix into a nightmare of explosions, gunfire, and desperate survival. Sarah was in the medical facility preparing medications when the first mortar round screamed overhead, its distinctive whistle cutting through the morning air like a harbinger of death. The explosion shook the entire building, sending supplies tumbling from shelves and patients diving for cover. Through the reinforced windows, Sarah could see plumes of black smoke rising from the motor pool where the first shell had found its mark. The attack had begun with devastating precision, targeting the base's most vulnerable assets while soldiers were still adjusting to the morning shift change. Dr. Chen's voice cut through the chaos with professional calm. "All medical personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill." Sarah's training kicked in immediately. her hands moving with practiced efficiency to secure critical supplies while her mind shifted into the focused clarity that had served her through countless emergency situations. The second wave of mortar fire walked across the base like giant footsteps, each explosion closer than the last. Sarah felt the concussion waves through her body as windows rattled and debris rained down from the ceiling. Outside, she could hear the sharp crack of rifle fire as the base's defenders engaged targets that seemed to be everywhere at once. From his position in the northeast tower, Miguel had been among the first to spot the enemy forces. Through his scope, he could see muzzle flashes erupting from concealed positions in the hills overlooking the base. The attackers had clearly spent days, perhaps weeks, preparing for this assault, establishing firing positions, and coordinating their attack to achieve maximum surprise and devastation. Contact. Multiple hostiles in the northeast sector. Miguel's voice crackled over the radio as he acquired his first target. A distant figure was preparing to fire a rocket-propelled grenade at the base's communications center. Miguel's breathing slowed to the controlled rhythm he had practiced thousands of times, his finger finding the familiar curve of his trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, and, through his scope, Miguel saw the enemy fighter spin and fall. The RPG round sailed harmlessly into the sky, exploding against the mountainside instead of its intended target. But, even as one threat was eliminated, dozens more seemed to take its place. "Thompson, I need targets," Miguel called to his spotter, who was frantically scanning the terrain with high-powered binoculars. "I've got machine gun position, 200 meters, 11 o'clock. Thompson responded, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Crew of 3, preparing to engage our gate guards." Miguel swiveled his rifle toward the indicated position, his scope revealing a team of enemy fighters setting up a heavy machine gun that could devastate any attempt to evacuate casualties or bring in reinforcements. The range was challenging, made more difficult by the morning heat shimmer rising from the desert floor, but Miguel had made harder shots under worse conditions. His second shot silenced the machine gun permanently, but the victory was short-lived. The base was under assault from multiple directions, with enemy forces that had clearly studied every weakness in the defensive perimeter. Explosions continued to rock the compound as mortar teams that had remained hidden until this moment revealed their positions by opening fire. In the medical facility, Sarah's world had transformed into a scene from her worst nightmares. The first casualties began arriving within minutes of the attack start. Soldiers with blast injuries, burns, and shrapnel wounds that tested every skill she had learned during her years in emergency medicine. But this was different from anything she had experienced in civilian hospitals. The wounded kept coming while the battle raged around them, and each explosion reminded everyone that they were all potential casualties. "Sarah, I need you on the soldier with the chest wound." Dr. Chun shouted over the noise of incoming fire. A young private had been caught in the open when the mortar barrage began, and shrapnel from a near miss had penetrated his body armor, leaving him with a sucking chest wound that was rapidly becoming life-threatening. Sarah moved to the wounded soldier with a focused intensity that had made her reputation in trauma medicine. Despite the chaos around her, her hands remained steady as she assessed the injury and began emergency treatment. The private was barely conscious, his breathing labored, and his face pale from blood loss and shock. "What's your name, soldier?" Sarah asked as she worked, using her voice to keep him focused and alert. "Rodriguez," the young man gasped. "Private Rodriguez. Am I going to die?" Sarah looked into his frightened eyes and saw someone barely old enough to vote, far from home, and facing mortality in the worst possible circumstances. "Not on my watch, Rodriguez," she said firmly, applying an occlusive dressing to seal his chest wound. "You're going to be fine, but I need you to stay with me, okay?" As she worked to stabilize Rodriguez, Sarah became aware of a new sound cutting through the battle. The distinctive crack of Miguel's rifle from his position in the tower. Each shot was deliberate and precise, and she knew that with every trigger pull, her husband was saving lives by eliminating threats to the base. The knowledge filled her with pride, even as fear for his safety gnawed at her concentration. The medical facility began to resemble a battlefield hospital from a war movie as more casualties arrived. A sergeant with severe burns on his arms and face, a specialist with a compound fracture from diving for cover, a lieutenant who had been knocked unconscious by a blast wave. Each patient required immediate attention while the sound of battle continued to rage outside. Dr. Chun moved between patients with practiced efficiency, prioritizing treatment based on who could be saved and who was beyond help. It was a brutal calculus that civilian medicine rarely faced, but in combat zones, medical personnel had to make decisions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. "Sarah," Dr. Chen called out during a brief lull in new arrivals. "How are you holding up?" Sarah looked up from the floor. She was starting on a soldier with severe dehydration and shock. Her scrubs were covered in blood. Her hair was disheveled, and exhaustion was beginning to set in despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I'm okay," she said, though her voice revealed the strain she was under. "How much longer do you think this will last?" Before Dr. Chin could answer, a tremendous explosion shook the building more violently than any previous blast. The lights flickered and went out, emergency lighting casting everything in an eerie red glow. Through the windows, Sarah could see that a section of the base's outer wall had been breached, and enemy fighters were attempting to pour through the gap. From his tower position, Miguel had a clear view of the breach and the enemy forces massing to exploit it. His radio crackled with desperate calls for fire support as the base's defenders struggled to contain the assault. The situation was rapidly becoming critical. If the enemy forces succeeded in establishing a foothold inside the base perimeter, the medical facility would be in direct danger. "All sniper teams, concentrate fire on the breach," came the command over the radio. Miguel began engaging targets as fast as he could acquire them, his rifle heating up from the rapid fire. Each shot had to count because there were more enemy fighters than he had ammunition, and missing could mean the difference between holding the line and watching the base fall. Thompson kept up a steady stream of target information, his binoculars revealing new threats as quickly as Miguel could eliminate existing ones. Machine gun team moving to flank the breach. Bearing 270, range 300 meters. Miguel swung his rifle toward the new threat, seeing through his scope a team of enemy fighters attempting to set up an enfilade position that would allow them to fire down the length of the defensive line. His shot took out the machine gunner just as the weapon was being brought into action, but the assistant gunner immediately moved to take his place. The battle had become a desperate struggle for survival, with the outcome hanging in the balance. In the medical facility, Sarah continued treating wounded soldiers while the sound of gunfire grew closer and more intense. She could hear the sharp reports of assault rifles mixing with the deeper boom of grenades and the distinctive crack of sniper rifles from multiple positions around the base. Dr. Chun had moved to the window and was observing the tactical situation with growing concern. "Sarah," she said quietly, "we need to prepare for the possibility that we might have to evacuate. The enemy forces are getting closer to this building." Sarah looked around at the wounded soldiers filling every available bed and stretcher. Private Rodriguez was still alive, but would need continued medical attention. The sergeant with burns was stabilizing, but couldn't be moved safely. Several other patients were in critical condition and would almost certainly die if they were forced to evacuate under fire. "We can't leave these patients," Sarah said firmly. "Some of them won't survive a move, and we can't abandon wounded soldiers." Dr. Chin nodded, having reached the same conclusion. "Then we stay and hope the perimeter holds." She picked up an M4 rifle that had belonged to one of the wounded soldiers. "Do you know how to use one of these?" Sarah stared at the weapon, realizing that her world was about to change in ways she had never imagined. In all her years of medical training, she had focused on saving lives, not taking them. But looking at the wounded soldiers around her, she understood that sometimes protecting life required a willingness to fight for it. "I've done some target shooting," she said, accepting the rifle with hands that trembled slightly. "But I've never—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Dr. Chun understood. "Let's hope you won't have to," Dr. Chun replied. "But if enemy forces breach this facility, will be the last line of defense for our patients." Outside, the battle continued to rage with undiminished intensity. Miguel's position in the tower had become a focal point for enemy fire as his accurate shooting continued to disrupt their assault. Bullets sparked off the concrete around his position, and Thompson had been forced to take cover after a near miss had sent concrete fragments into his face. "Martinez, we're running low on ammunition," Thompson called out, blood trickling from small cuts on his cheek. "How many rounds you got left?" Miguel checked his remaining magazines, his heart sinking as he counted. "Maybe 30 rounds, he replied. "That's not going to last much longer at this rate." The radio crackled with increasingly desperate calls for ammunition resupply, medical evacuation, and air support. But the intensity of the enemy fire had made movement around the base extremely dangerous, and help seemed to be a long way off. The defenders of Forward Operating Base Phoenix were on their own, fighting for their lives with whatever resources they had left. In the medical facility, Sarah found herself facing a moment of truth that would define the rest of her life. The sound of gunfire was now close enough that she could hear individual weapons firing just outside the building. Dr. Chen had taken position at one window, while Sarah moved to another, both of them watching for any sign that enemy forces had breached the building's perimeter. Through her window, Sarah could see muzzle flashes erupting from positions that were far too close for comfort. The base's outer defenses were holding, but just barely, and everyone knew that the situation could change in an instant. The woman who had come to surprise her husband with a visit was about to discover depths of courage and determination she had never known she possessed. The moment that would forever change Sarah Martinez from a military spouse into a legend came with the sharp crack of splintering wood as the medical facility's rear door was blown open by an explosive charge. Through the smoke and debris, the distinctive silhouettes of enemy fighters appeared, their weapons trained on the wounded soldiers who lay helpless in their beds. Time seemed to slow as Sarah's mind processed the impossible situation unfolding before her. These weren't the faceless enemies Miguel fought from his sniper tower. These were human beings with weapons pointed directly at wounded American soldiers who couldn't defend themselves. In that crystalline moment of absolute clarity, every instinct Sarah had developed as a healer collided with a deeper, more primal need to protect those under her care. Dr. Chun was positioned near the main entrance, too far away to respond to this new threat. The enemy fighters were already inside, their weapons sweeping the room as they identified targets. Private Rodriguez, the young soldier Sarah had worked so hard to save, lay directly in their line of fire, still connected to the four that was keeping him alive. Without conscious thought, Sarah raised the M4 rifle Dr. Chun had given her. Her hands, which had trembled when she first picked up the weapon, were now steady with absolute purpose. The targeting fundamentals Miguel had taught her during weekend shoots back home came flooding back: sight alignment, breathing control, smooth trigger pull. But this wasn't a paper target at a safe shooting range. This was life and death. The first enemy fighter turned toward her just as Sarah fired. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and through a haze of adrenaline and disbelief, she saw the man stumble and fall. Her second shot took down his companion before he could bring his own weapon to bear. The third fighter, realizing he was under accurate fire from an unexpected direction, scrambled for cover behind an overturned medical cart. "Dr. Chun," Sarah called out, her voice carrying a strength she didn't know she possessed. "3 hostiles in the rear section. I've got 2 down, 1 in cover behind the supply cart." Dr. Chin spun around, her own weapon ready, just as the remaining enemy fighter attempted to flank Sarah's position. The experienced military doctor's shots were precise and final, ending the immediate threat to their patients. But both women knew this was just the beginning. The breach in the rear of the facility meant that more enemies would follow. From his tower position, Miguel heard the gunfire from the medical facility over his radio, but the individual shots were lost in the general chaos of the battle. He had no way of knowing that his wife had just killed 2 enemy fighters to protect wounded American soldiers. His own situation was becoming increasingly desperate as enemy forces concentrated their fire on his position, trying to eliminate the sniper who had been causing them such devastating casualties. "Thompson," Miguel shouted over the noise of bullets impacting around their position. "We need to move. They've got our range." Thompson, blood still trickling from the shrapnel cuts on his face, was already gathering their essential gear. "Where to?" "They've got every approach covered." Miguel scanned the tactical situation through his scope, looking for an alternative position that would allow him to continue engaging targets while avoiding the concentrated fire that was making their current location untenable. His eye caught movement near the medical facility, and his blood ran cold as he realized enemy forces were attempting to infiltrate the building where Sarah was working. "Change of mission," Miguel announced, his voice carrying the deadly calm that came over him in the most critical moments. "Medical facility is under direct assault. We're moving to provide overwatch." The 2 snipers began a dangerous movement under fire, using whatever cover they could find to reach a position where Miguel could engage the enemies threatening the medical facility. It was a risk that violated basic sniper doctrine, leaving a prepared position to move during active combat. But Miguel couldn't remain in his tower knowing that Sarah was in immediate danger. Back in the medical facility, Sarah and Dr. Chan worked frantically to move their most critically wounded patients to more secure positions while maintaining their defensive watch. The breach in the rear wall meant that their sanctuary had become a combat zone, but neither woman was willing to abandon the soldiers who depended on them for survival. Sarah, Dr. Chan called out as she repositioned Private Rodriguez away from the exposed rear area. "You did good back there. Those shots saved a lot of lives." Sarah was checking her remaining ammunition, a task she would never have imagined herself performing just days earlier. "I keep thinking about what Miguel always says, that every shot has to count because there are no second chances. I guess I understand what he means now." The lull in enemy activity around the medical facility was temporary. Through the damaged rear entrance, both women could hear the sounds of combat growing closer as enemy forces pushed deeper into the base perimeter. The distinctive sound of American weapons mixed with the different reports of enemy rifles, creating a deadly symphony that meant the battle was far from over. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson's voice crackled over the facility's radio, barely audible over the static and background noise of the ongoing battle. "Medical facility, this is base command. What's your status? We're showing enemy contact at your location." Dr. Chan grabbed the radio handset. "Base command, medical here. We've repelled an infiltration attempt with multiple enemy Kia. Facility is secure for now, but we have critically wounded patients who cannot be moved. Request immediate security reinforcement. Medical, be advised that all available personnel are engaged. You're on your own for the foreseeable future. Air support is en route, but ETA unknown. Hold your position and defend your patients." Dr. Chun and Sarah exchanged a look that communicated everything they didn't need to say aloud. They were effectively cut off, responsible not only for their own survival, but for the lives of a dozen wounded soldiers who couldn't defend themselves. The weight of that responsibility settled on both women like a physical burden, but neither wavered in their determination. Miguel and Thompson had successfully moved to a new position that provided them with overwatch of the medical facility. Through his scope, Miguel could see the damage to the rear of the building and the evidence of the firefight that had taken place there. His heart hammered as he realized how close Sarah had come to being killed or captured. "I've got multiple targets moving on the medical facility," Thompson reported through his binoculars. "Squad-sized element, approaching from the northeast. They're using the damaged wall as a reference point." Miguel adjusted his scope, acquiring targets among the enemy fighters who were preparing for another assault on the building where his wife was fighting for her life. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had spent months protecting soldiers he barely knew, only to find himself in a position where he was literally fighting to save the woman he loved more than life itself. His first shot dropped the enemy squad leader just as the man was signaling for his team to advance. The second shot eliminated a fighter carrying what appeared to be explosives intended to finish the job of breaching the medical facility. But there were still more enemies than Miguel had bullets, and they were beginning to realize they were under fire from a new direction. In the medical facility, Sarah heard the distinctive crack of Miguel's rifle and felt a surge of hope mixed with fear. She recognized the sound of her husband's weapon, which meant he was close enough to provide support, but also close enough to be in mortal danger himself. Dr. Chun had taken position at the main entrance while Sarah covered the breached rear wall. Between them, they had a clear field of fire across most of the facility's interior, but they were still vastly outnumbered by the enemy forces attempting to overrun their position. "Contact rear," Sarah called out as she spotted movement through the damaged wall. Enemy fighters were using the smoke and debris to mask their approach, but Sarah's position gave her a clear view of their staging area. Her shots were careful and deliberate, each one aimed with the precision Miguel had taught her, and the desperation of someone fighting to protect the helpless. The enemy fighters were clearly surprised to encounter such accurate fire from what they had assumed was a medical facility staffed only by noncombatants. Their assault faltered as Sarah's shooting disrupted their formation and forced them to take cover instead of advancing. Dr. Chun, watching through the main entrance, saw additional enemy forces attempting to flank their position. Her military training, combined with years of experience in combat zones, allowed her to read the tactical situation and respond accordingly. "Sarah, they're trying to surround us. I count at least 8 hostiles moving to encircle the building." Sarah felt a moment of despair as the magnitude of their situation became clear. They were 2 women with limited ammunition, responsible for protecting a dozen wounded soldiers, surrounded by enemy forces who had no intention of taking prisoners. The logical part of her mind said the situation was hopeless, but the part of her that had fallen in love with a soldier and had traveled halfway around the world to surprise him refused to accept defeat. "Then, we make them pay for every inch," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a steely determination that surprised even her. She had discovered something about herself in this moment of ultimate crisis, a core of strength and courage that she had never known existed. Miguel's radio crackled with reports from around the base as the battle reached its climax. The enemy assault was beginning to falter under the determined resistance of the American defenders, but isolated pockets of fighting continued, including the desperate struggle around the medical facility. Through his scope, Miguel could see Sarah's silhouette moving purposefully around the interior of the medical facility as she maintained her defensive position. The woman he had married for her gentleness and compassion had transformed into a warrior fighting to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Pride and fear wore in his chest as he continued to engage targets, trying to reduce the pressure on her position. The final enemy assault on the medical facility came just as the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the compound. A dozen enemy fighters made a coordinated rush on the building from multiple directions, hoping to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers and aggression. Sarah's world contracted to the simple mechanics of aimed fire: sight picture, breathing, trigger control. Each shot had to count because she was down her last magazine. Beside her, Dr. Chin's weapon spoke with measured authority as she engaged targets approaching the main entrance. The enemy fighters made it closer this time, some of them reaching the walls of the building before Miguel's overwatch fire and the women's defensive shooting stopped their advance. The area around the medical facility became littered with the evidence of their failed assault, but Sarah knew they didn't have the ammunition to repel another such attack. Just as the situation seemed most desperate, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors filled the air. 2 Apache attack helicopters appeared over the ridgeline, their guns already engaging the remaining enemy positions around the base. The tide of battle had finally turned, and the surviving enemy fighters began a hasty retreat rather than face the devastating firepower of the arriving air support. As the sound of gunfire gradually faded and the helicopters continued their deadly work against the fleeing enemy forces, Sarah found herself sitting on the floor of the medical facility, her back against a medical cabinet, the empty rifle across her knees. The transformation was complete. The woman who had come to surprise her husband had become a warrior who had helped save dozens of lives through her courage and skill. Dr. Chan appeared beside her, equally exhausted, but wearing a look of profound respect. "Sarah, in 20 years of military medicine, I've never seen anything like what you did today. You saved every life in this facility." Miguel burst through the main entrance of the medical facility, having abandoned his sniper position the moment the immediate threat was over. He found Sarah still sitting on the floor, surrounded by the wounded soldiers she had fought so hard to protect. When their eyes met, no words were necessary. They both understood that their relationship had been forged anew in the crucible of combat. As Miguel knelt beside his wife and took her in his arms, Sarah realized that her surprise visit had become something neither of them could have anticipated. She had come to understand his world, but in doing so, she had discovered parts of herself that she had never known existed. The woman who had traveled thousands of miles to surprise her husband had become a legend in her own right, proving that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism come from the most unexpected places. The battle for Forward Operating Base Phoenix was over, but the story of Sarah Martinez, the nurse who became a sniper to protect her patients, would be told and retold for years to come. She had come to visit her husband, but she had stayed to fight alongside him, and in doing so, she had earned her place among the warriors who defended freedom in the world's most dangerous places.